She couldn't get the words out, perhaps because she was growing less and less certain what she wanted. Shouldn't she be focused on helping her family? Welcome to The Storming Journey, a sacred text reading of The Stormlight Archive by Brandon Sanderson. This podcast may contain spoilers for the Stormlight Archive through Wind and Truth. Hello everyone, welcome back to The Storming Journey. Today we're going to be discussing Chapter 42, Beggars and Barmaids from the Way of Kings, and I will be your Ardent for this episode. My name is Liz.
I'm Elle, and I'm today's Worldsinger.
And I'm Adam, and I'm the Veristitalian.
So today's theme is commitment, which means that I was thinking about all the times I have overcommitted myself to things because I thrive on having more projects than I do time. And by thrive, I mean, I think it's fun, but then I collapse in stress. But I don't have any particularly interesting stories about that. So the month that this episode comes out in is the 10-year anniversary of when my husband and I got married, which is the biggest emotional commitment I have ever made. And is a ongoing commitment, but not in the way that I think we sometimes talk about marriage of oh, it's so hard. I have to choose every day to love my husband, because that's just not how it is for me. It's like an easy ongoing commitment of I get to spend time with my best friend on a regular basis. And the hard things are you have two people who want different things and you have to figure out how to make those priorities work, but it's not hard in the sense of I would say casual marriage culture ends up talking about marriage. So yes, today is a celebration of the commitment that I am made. There's an anniversary of. Just felt like being happy about that.
Yay for Elle and Elle's husband. So I have our Storm's Eye view. Shallan returns to Jasnah with an answer to the lesson. Jasnah's actions were legal and right, but not moral and ethical. Happy with the result of Shallan's research, Jasnah gives her the day off. What are you? The whisper breaks into Shallan's sketching. Thinking it a cleaning maid, Shallan tries to discover answers to soul casting in Jasnah's room. Casbel's knock breaks into Shallan's rummaging, and she joins him for jam, trauma, and mysteries. A letter waits for her after the picnic. Tazbek and the Wind's Pleasure sail to Kharbranth and Shallan's future.
It's a very interesting chapter. There's a lot of things going on here that Shallan doesn't understand yet. So I picked this theme for the chapter inspired by the line that stuck out to me the most, besides of course, the whispering of the cryptics, which is Kabsel offering to leave the Ardentia for Shallan. And that made me think of the idea of commitments and when it's a good idea to break commitments and when it's a bad idea to break commitments. So I wanted to look at the various different people and what they're committed to in this chapter and whether that's serving them well or not. So we have Shallan's commitment to both saving her family and her growing commitment to her research and to Jasnah, possibly Pattern's growing commitment to Shallan as her spren Shallan, Kabsel's supposed commitment to the Ardentian, whether that's real or not, it's still an interesting concept. Jasnah's commitment to her research as exemplified by her notebooks, and of course the Ghostblood's commitment to getting Jasnah's soulcaster through Kabsel. Maybe through this maid that shows up to clean Jasnah's room, even though they've been asked not to. We were debating before we started recording whether she's actually a Ghostblood. I think I intuit that she is. Elle, you were saying maybe not. So we'll see. But the Ghostbloods are definitely committed to their ends for sure. So where should we start? Which commitments were interesting to you as you're reading this chapter?
Really, first, we have to ask, who among us hasn't had a man leave the priesthood for us? Who among us has not had that happen? I've had that happen.
This is a totally normal thing.
It is in gay Utah.
I thought your question, Liz, of like, when should we give up a commitment was really fascinating because I was thinking, again, through all of my myriad commitments. And so I was like, okay, well, what is a commitment anyways? Is it like really a formal thing? And so I was, in the dictionary as one does. But I think that like it makes sense to give up a commitment when priorities are misaligned with your reason for like your commitment is no longer in line with your personal priorities and or a change in circumstances. And like when you are faced with the fact that your priorities no longer align with your commitment, then you either like recommit yourself and like change your own priorities back to matching the commitment, or you give up the commitment that you've had and those priorities. And so I think like with Shallan, her commitments to like scholarship are like she's recommitting herself to that because her family priorities don't feel as interesting or like as aligned with like her real personality, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I also think there's a second layer to that where she has to commit herself to the scholarship because she's uncommitting herself from Yasna, which is what happened in the previous chapters, right? When she realizes that Yasna is very cold and unemotional when making certain decisions, like in the lesson, she uncommitted from Yasna. But in this chapter, she's not quite committing to Yasna and like Yasna's scholarship. She's trying to commit to her own, right? So you see that kind of shift of commitment happening and that shift of, and that changing of like how she was committed to Yasna for a little bit. But then when that broke, she changes that commitment over to scholarship and kind of delves more into that.
Yeah, it is kind of cute at the end that she comes back and she's like, what I actually want to do is do research. Very adorable. Love that for Shallan, that she wants to make the most of this time that she has, but can she fully commit to that when she knows she has to leave? It's really interesting. Like, when you know that your commitments conflict with each other, how do you react to that? And Shallan seems to be like, I'm just gonna YOLO. I'm gonna live in the moment. Like, I have 2 weeks or another week until this boat shows up. So I'm gonna be a scholar for that week and forget about these other things that are worrying me and just commit to the bit.
It reminds me so much of like the relationship of so many queer people with the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, where it's like, as they're trying to figure out whether they want to live in this way or live in that way and how they want to live their life, right? They go through a period of like fervor and commitment to Mormonism, right? Like going to the temple every morning or reading scriptures every morning. And there's this like cycle of commitment, even though like there's this like trial for other forms of living and other forms of life, right? Like I don't want to call it lifestyles, but like, because that's such a loaded word when it comes to the queer community and relationship to religion. But the thinking of how we're relating to commitment, how we're thinking about it is so connected to the broader things of Mormon theology when it comes to like covenants, when it comes to those promises, when it comes to the broader things and like the decisions that people make when they decide to leave that or to stick with it is such a deeper notion in this idea. And I think like commitment to me has a lesser connotation than like covenant or promise or vow, right? But it's still all tied up in that committing yourself fully to something or someone, which Shallan never, I think, fully commits either way here, right? In all the parts, right? The reason why she is struggling so much is she's not fully committed to stealing the Soulcaster. She's not fully committed to scholarship. She's not fully committed to these things. And she never really does fully commit throughout the books, right? She doesn't fully commit to scholarship, even though she's a scholar. I'm thinking specifically of when she gets in Words of Radiance to the war camps, and she gets that one moment of like catharsis where she finally gets to be a scholar or gets to, you know, figure out a scholar thing, because all the time she's been thieving or she's been spying or she's been figuring out her powers and things like that, and she hasn't been able to fully commit that. And I think that's something that Shallan never fully gets to do, is fully commit.
I also really like the idea of like the relationship between your actions and your level of commitment, right? Because we see this like, you know, flirty banter between Capsule and Shallan, but there's not a lot of like real indication of commitment. Like there's just like the things they say, but then like nobody's doing anything about it. And so maybe an indication of your commitment is what you choose to actually do. And you have to actually try it out in order to figure out if you want to be committed to it. And they're kind of on the border of like, do we actually commit to a relationship? Does Shallan actually commit to a relationship? I don't think Capsule actually is committing to anything. I think he's just trying to get information out of Shallan. But Shallan is definitely on the edge of like, she's unwilling to tell him no, but she's also not willing to act on it either.
I mean, is there a reading of Capsule where him saying that he's willing to leave the Ardentia is him actually willingly saying that he not wants to, but could leave the ghost bloods for her? Like, is there, I don't think that reading could fully come out, right? Like, there's not enough textual evidence for us to really pull that out. But like, if we're thinking about the Ardentia being a stand-in for the ghost bloods and him offering this, like, that's such a different twist in his character, I think, and a different move in how we see Capsule, right? Because if we're reading him as just this Ghostbloods operative, who every single action he does is on behalf of the Ghostbloods, then he's leading Shallan down this like his faking of commitment is a way to pull her heartstrings so he can get to Yasna, which is how it kind of reads out, right? But if we see it in a different light, right, where it's like Capsule's actually struggling with his relationship to the Ghostbloods, I think we get a little bit of redemption, perhaps, or a little bit more muddying of his characterization and of his very lackluster attempt to murder Yasna, shall we say.
I think there's enough textual evidence here to like support that idea. I think Capsule seems okay. Capsule could be a really good actor. I will grant that. But in this scene, he seems like genuinely at odds with his mission versus his feelings for Shallan. And I think that because we know that he's not like really an Ardent, I think that there's a valid reading of saying he's willing to leave the Ghostbloods to be with Shallan as a stand-in. Ardentia being the stand-in for what being a Ghostbloods could be. Because like I do think he's reckoning with, okay, is being this operative really like possible to do and have a relationship with this woman? Can I give that up? And I think he's me reckoning with it out loud and trying to talk through that. And either letting himself get talked out of it by Shallan or talking himself out of it of like, okay, actually maybe this is way too big to like make a decision on.
There's just so much we don't know about Capsule that gets kind of cut off because, you know, he dies. Minor problems. That we like it's not clear whether he's a really incompetent Ghostblood operative or a really competent and very fervently religious Ghostblood operative. I don't know what is going on with him, but I do find him really interesting, and this whole dilemma he put Shallan in very interesting.
I think it's also to think about commitment, how he is leading Shallan along with commitment, right? So it's not just someone committing to something, but it's like the promise of potential commitment is something that he's using as a tool for manipulation. If we're reading it in the like full-on Ghostbloods, he's using every single aspect of his life to get it to that, which I think like there's a dual layer there, right? Where it could be both. But I think like it shows how what we can be committed to can be something that we don't agree with. And so we change our commitment, but it's also that someone else's potential of commitment kind of leads us down a certain path or could guide us down a certain path or could drag us down a certain path, thinking about how much we rely on or create a reliance on someone else's commitment or someone else's promise of a commitment. And how like commitment is like much more layered in that way, right? It's not just us making commitments. It's commitment becoming a web of different measures and different like weights against each other and for each other and toward different paths.
It reminds me of one of the breakups I went through. I remember like having this conversation with the guy, and he was talking about how he was going to graduate early and like a semester or two earlier than I was planning on graduating, and then was going to go do X and Y. And I was like, so how do I figure into this plan? Because I had assumed that we had an agreed commitment between us that we were going to be doing future stuff together. And he goes, well, I don't think you do, or something along those lines. And it was like, oh, you didn't see our commitment as the same thing, but I was making my future plans as dependent on your commitment. And so like, I just very much identify with that idea of all of our commitments are wrapped up in each other. And like, you can't make commitments without other people having also made commitments to do things.
I think that's such an interesting way to think about Yasna then, where her breakneck pace on her own commitment doesn't matter about anyone else's commitment, right? Like whether Shallan is there as her ward or not does not matter for Shallan. Other people's commitments don't matter because of how forward thinking she is. But at the same time, that creates the negative aspect of when all of Yasna's stuff sinks to the bottom of the ocean, spoiler alert, Words of Radiance, there's no one to continue her path because she is so committed and relies only on herself and doesn't care about other people's commitments, like they can come and go. She creates a space where something negative happens, where there's this loss of this thing that could have potentially saved them a lot of time, saved us about 1,000 pages, at least in our reading. Thanks, Yasna. That's the only bad thing Yasna's ever done in her entire life. But whereas in your commitment, Elle, it was like you were making decisions based on the commitment of someone else and your assumption of their commitment. I'm seeing Yasna as not making decisions based on other people's commitments, which actually forms a hubris in her character. There are many hubrises in her character, of course.
I think another nascent to be formed commitment that's going on in this chapter we should talk about is like this voice that Shallan hears of the what are you, which like we know from our knowledge of the future books that like this is a spread reaching out to her to try to get her to say a truth so that they can initiate this commitment, this Nahal bond between the Radiant and the spread, right? And that Shallan has done this before and broken it, right? And yet this Spren are still like insisting on following her and like committing to her again, which is really interesting to look at this in terms of, are they waiting around in spite of Shallan maybe not being as committed to them as they are to her, right? Pattern is like, I'm sure you're going to kill me, but I'm going to hang around anyway for reasons. And that's really interesting to put in contrast to what's happening between Shallan and Capsule.
I think that it ends up being that like Pattern and the Cryptics are committed to a greater cause than Shallan. And I think I can think of a lot of examples in my life where like I'm committed to something or someone to a greater degree than they're committed back to me because I'm committed to something that's beyond them as an individual. And like, I'm not a cryptic, so that comes with a bunch of heartbreak and frustration and negotiation of how things work. But like, I still make that commitment, or I am committed to that higher thing because that feels more, that's in line with my priorities and my interests and my preferences or whatever. And so I think I admire Pattern and the Cryptics for like holding to that, even though that could come at a significant cost to them because they're aware of what happened to Testament.
Well, I think like a flip reading of that, which I enjoy reading out, but I think as well, like there's a question of abuse when it comes to commitment in relation to that, right? Like the reaction to that commitment, like in some ways, Shallan's relationship to the Cryptics is a little bit abusive, right? It's a returning to your abuser. It's returning to someone that's done something bad. In some way, which I don't want to read that entirely throughout those valences, right? But I think thinking about that in relation to Shallan's relationship with Capsule, how Capsule is using commitment as a way of abuse in some ways, right? A way to get through Shallan to Yasna, and how, like, if you're too committed to someone else, that can become an abusive relationship, and that has a potential and that nascentness to be that way. Because I do think like returning to Shallan has more layers than just Shallan being a really good liar, right? Like there's that big bombshell at the end of the entire series where it's like, oh, your mama's such and such, right? Which like I think like creates different magical valences in this world. But I'm also thinking about that broader thing of like you can have that commitment to a broader thing, and so you commit yourself to someone. But then there's also like someone can pull on that commitment in a way to make the relationship not a positive relationship and more of a negative relationship. And there's a potentiality there, right? That like I think Pattern and the others are kind of walking into. And maybe that's like a part of their like entire like raison d'etre or anything, right? Like maybe that is what a cryptic is, and so they see it a little bit differently than you'd see it as a human relationship. But I think there's like a layer of that in here when we think about an overcommitment or a different layer or different level of commitment between people.
And yeah, I definitely agree that like there is a level of commitment where it reaches a point where other people manipulate that commitment where it's harmful and not beneficial. Like, I'm just agreeing with you on that, because I think there is a committing yourself to a cause beyond an individual because the cause is important, but then there is that commitment can be manipulated and harmed, and I think we see lots of examples of that in most of our lives.
Well, and it's like such a personal thing too, where it's like if you are committing yourself to a larger thing, you have to recognize that and realize that that's happening, right? Versus like when you're committing yourself to something even more, but it's in an abusive way or there's some abuse in that relationship, you also have to realize that. And like, you have to declare that, right? Like other people can't quite declare that on you. Like they can mention it or point toward it. But at the very end of it, you have to figure out your relationship to your commitments and your relationship to things around you, which is, I think, like something that Shallan struggles with is declaring and defining and figuring that out. Like thinking about her relationship with Adel and their struggle that they have for her to like really realize that this, nice, sexy bisexual man is into her or something, right? Like that alone shows her that she has a tenuous connection to understanding intimately her connection and her commitment to other people and how those commitments come out, which also I think comes out in her like, Capsule's going to leave the priesthood for me. What? I've only been going out for 2 weekends. Like, what is this, Mormonism? What is this, BYU? Is Carbranth BYU? But I think that's one of her things that she doesn't fully grow. Like she's growing and failing and discovering and learning it in the journey of the books. I think that's one thing that makes her narrative such a gripping one throughout all of the books.
And I think part of her indecisiveness is the fact that she's young and the fact that, she's grown up in this very controlled environment where she doesn't have a lot of choices. So she doesn't have a lot of experience picking the thing that she cares about and committing to it. She has been stuck most of her life with what other people give her and just choosing to accept it. And that's it. Like, she has no choice. And so I think she has trouble learning to exercise her choice because of that.
Well, I think too, I remember when I got to college, like I would sign up for things and I didn't want to be the person who dropped out because like so many people would like stop doing a thing or an activity or whatever. And I was like, well, I committed to this. Even if I'm not fully invested in it, I don't want to uncommit myself because I don't want to be the person that's like uncommitting. And so it felt like I was always like I didn't know how to like responsibly commit or uncommit myself because I like just didn't have enough practice like trying to figure out my own limits and my own boundaries of like how much commitment can I give before this is like not in line with what I'm doing. And I think Shallan Shallan is young. We keep forgetting how young Shallan is. And she is being a teenager who is off at college for the first time and a boy likes her and she likes him back kind of, but like there are complicated things and commitment is hard. And she's just making decisions as a teenager. And I identify with that. Shallan's messy.
But she's also making decisions that could lead all of Vorinism into war against Carbranth. I love that little like thing at the very end where Capsule's like, yeah, like if I did steal the soulcaster would probably like lead everyone and come kill us. So it's like, it's interesting because it's like she is a teenager, but there are these like larger things, and it makes you wonder like how perhaps we can help others, help those that are in our authority, like learn that more, right? Like thinking here how Liz and I teach teenagers, still 19-year-olds, 20-year-olds in high school, or not high school, in college, right? Like they're still learning commitment, which we see when they shoot us emails and say like, oh, I'm going to be 2 days late on that essay, which I mean, everyone in academia sees because we're all always late on an essay. But like at the same time, it's like when you're looking at life through this veil of commitments, I think it changes the growth and the learning and my mindset and my view of like what mortality is about in many ways, right? Like, 'cause I keep thinking about to a Mormon valence of like, you make a covenant with God, but then it's like that covenant's for a long life. And sometimes other things happen. Like sometimes you go to the temple and then after you get home from the temple, you're like, oh, I'm gay. How do I do this? And so you make decisions on whether or not you're going to keep those commitments that you made, which is something that like I've struggled a lot through. And so I think thinking about this in relation to commitment is important, but also it's important to think about how can we help people develop their ability to take on commitments, their ability to face how to say no to a commitment or how to change their life in relation to a commitment, and how like, even though Shallan's a teenager, we can still teach teenagers things, right? Like, I know that like, it's a good, I'm not going to call it an excuse, like it's a good acknowledgement, but at the same time, it's like, how can we create a world where we're all helping each other better commit and better uncommit at the same time?
Well, I think a lot of that is knowing what the consequences of your commitments or lack of commitments are. Like, Shallan doesn't know how to commit to scholarship because she doesn't know what that means, or she doesn't know what that means for her family if she doesn't come back with the soulcaster. She can't commit to, like, telling Yasna the truth because she doesn't know the outcome of telling Yasna the truth. And, like, when I've felt like a crisis point with commitments of like figuring out, am I going to continue on this or not? It's been somewhat of a, okay, well then if I commit to that, what are the consequences? And sometimes I can know because of my past experience, and sometimes I can't know. But like, I think helping make consequences of commitments clear makes it easier. I mean, that's why you have syllabus day on your first day of school, so you know, okay, here's what I am committing to by taking this class. Can I actually commit to this or not? Like, I took a Finnish literature class in college, and I had like 2.5 maybe years of Finnish study, and I'd been to Finland for like a week and a half. So like my Finnish skills were very low. And I signed up for this class, and I get there the first day, and I am like, I cannot read all of these classic Finnish literature books in Finnish. It's not going to happen. I ended up talking to the teacher. I was like, I don't think I can fulfill this commitment, basically. And he's like, you know what? I understand your circumstances are very different than all these returned missionaries that are in the class. Read what you can, and I will grade you based on that. And I was like, okay, that's a manageable commitment. I can commit to that. And so, like, I think just having the context and the understanding of this is what I'm committing to makes it easier and a safer to make commitments.
That's very much reminding me of one of my favorite parenting teenager book stories. This book talks about this teenager who, like, their mom was having them, start making their own medical appointments and stuff, and they kept missing them. And the parent sits down and talks with them, and they realized it was because they didn't know what would happen if they called and canceled the appointment. Like, they thought they would be in big trouble if they did this thing instead of seeing it as something normal. And that's very much like this space of teenagerhood, is like you have the abilities of an adult, but you don't have the experience to know what the results of your actions will be. And so, yes, I think that definitely fits Shallan. We should remember that about her, especially as a very sheltered teenager, right? She does not have a lot of reasonable expectations about what committing to something will mean for her future.
I think we can kind of then turn that on to Yasna, right? Her taking her as a ward and taking her as a ward in this time and things like that in the layers of like Yasna knowing, or should know, right? She's in her 30s. She's been royal her entire life, so she's had commitments, things like that. And like she doesn't quite, she's so committed to this thing that the only time she opens up is when she finds out, oh, hey, you may be a Night Radiant too. Or not that quite, but like she only opens up after a giant moment, right? And so it's like that full-on commitment that Yasna does blinds her in many ways. Kurt Capsule, right? How old is Capsule in this moment? And he's made this huge commitment to the Ghost Bloods. And I see Elle going on to Coppermine, so she's going to let us know. But like, I would think that he's about the age of Shallan. Maybe, I don't know if he's Rosharan or not.
He's 23, apparently.
Which is still very young. Frontal lobe is still not. I don't know. Do we bring a new layer to Capsule if we're thinking about him in the same way that we're trying to think about Shallan and give her grace in the same way? Or is it because Capsule's trying to murder someone that we don't give him that grace?
I mean, it does seem like a 23-year-old murder plan. Like, let's poison Jam, which she doesn't even like. This sounds like a great plan.
I mean, to be fair, it was bread that was poisoned. The jam was the antidote.
Right. Pretty convoluted still.
But he doesn't put the powder onto a book, right? Like he could have just powdered up a book and given it to her. And then she had to smell it in. But I was just listening to a podcast the other day and it talked about how someone figured out a way that her murder book could continue because an archivist told her that she had to touch like a hat with gloves because they used cyanide to preserve the feathers. And she's like, oh, I just figured out my next murder. But at the same time, like, I think Capsule shows the same immaturity that Shallan does, the same youthfulness, which I think like brings a different layer to his commitments and the choices he's made. And like, we don't get that, but it's still a question to ask.
Speaking of commitments, I wanted to talk more about soul casters and commitment. And I wanted to do this through our sacred reading method today, which we're going to be doing a cross-reference. And this time, our cross-reference is within the Stormlight archive. So I wanted to look at this scene in this chapter with Shallan trying to figure out the soul caster and cross-reference that with the person who we've seen who's the most competent soul caster, which is Kaza, which is in Oathbringer Interlude 4. She's the soulcaster who travels with the ship to Aemia, who's a savant. Her body is turning into smoke. So I wanted to look at the differences between the different attitudes to soul casting. So we have Capsule, who claims that soul casting is very not a big deal and not very mysterious, and Shallan's experience with soul casting, and we've seen a little bit of Yasna's experience with soul casting, and then we have Kaza's experience with soul casting as our cross-reference. How are these different attitudes related to the idea of commitment to the soul caster itself and to this process in the magic system? Because commitment is very bound up, as we mentioned, oaths are very bound up in the Rosharan magic system.
Something I wanted to highlight from the section, whether or not it ties specifically into commitment, we can chat about. But on page 563, Kaza could remember a time when she'd collected cremlings, pinning them to boards and proclaiming she'd become a natural historian. What had happened to that girl? She was transformed by necessity. And I was thinking about like Shallan in that moment of being a natural historian that she never, as we talked about, like really gets to engage with. She is transformed by necessity. She has to become a radiant. She has to become the wife of a high prince. She becomes all of these things that are not what she had wanted to become as a girl. And just kind of like, I thought that was an interesting to pull out that I wouldn't have thought about otherwise with this comparison between Shallan and Kaza.
For me, I pulled out the transformed by necessity, but then I pulled out two other things, which first is a quote of when Kaza describes what it's like to soul cast. She says, "It is blissful. I slowly connect to the device and through it to Roshar." and that commitment to like the planet itself. And when I was reading through, I was thinking specifically around like, what is Shallan missing when she's trying to use the Soulcaster? Which of course she's missing that the Soulcaster is also not real. And then Yasna is the Soulcaster here, and she's not using Yasna, but she's not using herself. But I was thinking about that layers of commitment, right? I'm solely connected. I'm solely committed to the device, and through the device to Roshar, which like can pull out, you know, different layers of religious commitment, thinking through like Catholicism with saints and the relationship and commitment to something towards something greater. But I think as well, like how it's like when we commit to something, there is that interwoven web of commitment. So the other thing was how Kaza's approach is more coaxing when she turns the stone back, or when she turns the air that was turned into stone into smoke. She's coaxing it back into its original form of air rather than demanding it, which I think is probably how Yasna does it more than coaxing. And it's just a different way to soulcast, right? Where you're coaxing it back into what it once was, or coaxing it into something and making it more comfortable, which I thought about in connection to like Cadwell's relationship with Shallan, right? Where he's coaxing her, trying to make her comfortable so that he can bring the poison and, you know, ultimately kill Yasna. And at the same time, the chapter ends with the declaration of Kaza making her becoming smoke her choice and her destiny, which destiny is never a choice necessarily, right? Destiny is always something that is thrust upon you, but it's also her choice at the same time. And it makes me think about a conversation on Patreon, like the discussion that we have around commitment and covenants and different layers within Mormonism, right? Of choosing it, but also being fed into it in many different ways. Is like this other layer of commitment that comes out for me, where it's like there's certain commitments that you do choose to make. You commit to someone else when you marry them, right? And you're making that choice. But at the same time, there's a destiny sense to it, right? Where it's like you're going to get married, especially if you're raised Mormon, or you're going to do this, or you choose a school, but you're always going to go to school when it comes to like an higher level education, thanks to all these other societal aspects to it that make it into a teleology or make it into a destiny. So I was thinking on those many different lines of commitment in relation to it.
I was also thinking about how Kaza has a relationship with her soulcaster, right? There's one part where she is soulcasting and she says she feels another will reinforcing her own. And the idea that a commitment, when it's functioning correctly between two people, is two people's wills aiming at the same thing and reinforcing each other. Whereas the way Capsule describes soulcasting is very instrumental. It's like you just make these motions and it just happens. There's no secret to it. It's just very mechanical. And that's the way Shallan is trying to do it as well with her non-functional soulcaster. But she's, you know, she's tried the very mechanical way of just tapping the stones. That's not working for her. So she's trying to form this relationship, right? She's speaking, concentrating, begging. She's practicing on a stick, which I'm like, did Sanderson know the stick was already going to be important to the next book at this point? Because this is the second time she practices soulcasting with the stick, and we see this continue with her, like, trying to form this relationship with this stick and teaching it to be fire, and it's not working for her. That she's having a hard time forming this relationship, whereas Kaza and her soulcaster are very, like, closely bonded. She thinks of the soulcaster as, like, hers, even though it belongs to the kingdom. Technically, it's part of her, from her perspective.
And that comes from her giving up so much, right? Like, she is literally becoming the essence that she can turn things into. And it makes you think through, like, when you're committed to something, not only are you shaping it, but it's shaping you, as you were saying. But that's not always like our commitments, right? Or like, that's not like I think that's those are usually the commitments that fail, right? Is where it's like, I'm committed to you, but I'm going to not change at all. Is something where it's like that commitment might fail. It might work out, but it's not as full, right? Like I keep thinking through the lovely marriage advice that people always give, where it's like, it's a 50-50 or it's 100-100. And it's like the percentages that you need to give to make it a marriage. But it's like, you don't give a percentage. You just do it. Right? Like seeing it as a percentage is such like I don't think that's like the best way to view a commitment per se, right? Whereas this more intimate relationship that you're pulling out, Liz, is so important when thinking about the things that we commit to, right? Because I think if you were thinking about commitment, thinking about how it's going to change you just as you're getting the thing that you're committing to, I think that might give someone pause before making a commitment, right? Like thinking about being the undergrad who's about to join 10 different clubs and make commitments to all of them, right? Like, are you pausing and thinking through how you want that to change you, how you are going to be serendipitously changed, and how you're also going to change it in that moment? And like that intimacy of relationship to commitment comes with maturity, of course, as we've talked about, but it's also like something to always ask ourselves before we commit to really anything. Now, I'm not saying like we should like pause and wait and go, let me ponder this before giving you $1 for that snow cone in my commitment of money. But like, I think it is something that like to pull into when we commit to things is that question of like, are we willing to be completely transformed by the necessity that this commitment takes a toll on us?
I think that's really interesting to think about in terms of this idea of marriage commitments that we've kind of brought up in a few different ways with Elle's world singing, is that we talked about how when you're young, you don't know the implications of commitment. And that can be one of the dangers of like marrying young, like a lot of Latter-day Saints do. But it's also like one of the advantages of marrying young is that you are so plastic at that age that it's much easier to make that kind of commitment that changes you and that you grow together, as opposed to marrying when you've already like been through a lot of life and set a lot of your patterns can be harder because it's difficult to change at that point. And so there's this plasticity that we see in Kaza, that she's willing to like completely commit and become something different in order to work with her soulcaster.
I almost think that Kaza is like the example of taking it too far, of like letting somebody change you so much you're no longer yourself. Like, she is no longer or even close to the natural historian she wanted to be. She had to give all of that up to be completely transformed. And like, I think there's like like we talked about with commitment, of overcommitting yourself and that becoming like abusive or unhealthy. And I think with Kaza, like, she has overcommitted herself. Like, you're supposed to like switch out the soulcasters. I think at some point they say how like they try not to have someone using it too much. They share it between people so that nobody is like becomes a savant in the same way.
I was just going to add my testimony to Liz's comment about marriage, being the only unmarried one in this room and also in my 30s. I am such a stick in the mud. If ever I go on a date, I'm like, I'm not changing anything for you. Like, I like my life. Like, no. And like, I can relate to that, where it's like, if I had been dating people that I was actually attracted to in my 20s and like found someone, it'd be a lot easier to form a life together. Whereas now I'm like, number one, are you willing to commit to as many books as I have? But number two, I'm not willing to change where my life's going for someone else. Like, I am absolutely not willing to change the trajectory I'm on, even if I found like the person who like I fully agree with and want to live with. It's like, I have certain goals and certain commitments that I've made that I'm not willing to change because I'm a stick in the mud. This is why I don't date. Well, I do date, but I mean, it's to me, it was it's the witness to what you were saying, right? Where it's like, I think if I had gotten married younger, I would be married now, right? But then I have like a strong relationship. But if I try to get married now, I don't. It's not working, and it hasn't worked, and it probably won't work because number one, I'm still not settled, but at the same time, like, I have certain things that I'm going toward that I won't let anything take me from those.
Yeah, so my father-in-law is a professor who studies marriage and how people choose who they marry. And like, he's talked about it as like this tipping point that like, you get married too young, there are problems. You get married too later, there are other problems. But like, at some point there's a perfect like balancing point. And it's obviously culturally dependent somewhat. But yeah, it's interesting to think about like the trade-off we make for making a full commitment at a younger age when we're more malleable versus when we have more knowledge and more awareness of what we're getting ourselves into.
I've cited your father-in-law, random fact, in a paper that's coming out this year.
Hey, I gotta read that.
It's on Orson Scott Card, so
There you go. There you go. Good fun. All right, we are committing to going to the wisdom of the heralds at this point and talking about what we want to take from this conversation, this reading of this chapter back into our lives.
I really love Adam's comment about before we make commitments, well, asking like if we're willing to let it transform us. Like that is such an interesting way to look at things, and I want to think about that. Like that is a question I think I want to be asking myself as being in a very transitory period of my life and like making different commitments. Now, like I want to think about how I want things to affect me and if they're going to affect me in ways that align with how I want to be as a person.
With our discussion about age and making commitments, it's made me think about, of course, my parenting and how I can help my children ease into figuring out their own commitments rather than me making those commitments for them. There's a lot of things that as a parent of young children, you commit for them. You're like, no, you will continue in your music lessons till the end of this school year, and then you can decide whether you want to quit. You can't quit now. But like transferring that responsibility and like, how can I be more intentional about offering them opportunities to make commitments and see how they affect them?
I think for me, in my teaching and higher education, I'm always thinking about what is a liberal arts education, as I think many people in the field are, especially nowadays with like an attack on a liberal arts education that's happening, and like what is the value of that? And I want to create that value in my classroom is something that I've kind of become more dedicated to over the last few months, especially because we've been doing this podcast and it's been making me think about my teaching and about my relationship to my students. But this podcast episode specifically makes me want to create a classroom where commitment is something that is tested out, but also the students can have meta moments with that commitment. Because I think that needs to happen a lot more in the classroom because it's such a safe space with not a lot of, like the entire world is not built on the letter grade that they get at the end. And so I think it's a space where it's a safe space to practice commitment and to practice failing at commitments and to practice walking away from commitments. And I want to think about how to actively do that and help my students see that I'm actively doing that so they can see what the value of their education is and what experience they get while they're still young, as we are always reminded Shallan is.
Thank you for joining us today on The Storming Journey. You can support our work on this podcast by subscribing to our Patreon, leaving a review, or sharing the podcast with a friend. We hope you'll join us next week, and in the meantime, remember, journey before destination.